Dr. Mike Ormsbee, you and your lab have really done some interesting research surrounding the world of protein and visceral fat and a number of other things with protein. I want to jump right into that, just get into the meat and potatoes of this, or I guess I should say, yeah, I guess just the meat, not necessarily the potatoes.
Right.
What have you guys been looking at, particularly with visceral fat?
Yeah, well, it's kind of all areas of fat, all the depots that we look at, but visceral is one of those. That's the one that we often think like tagged to health conditions and other issues that people can get with excessive visceral adipose tissue. And in our work, like we've done work for 20 years now, and we've had several different trials where we have either protein alone or protein with exercise, which is usually the most robust response. But we're seeing reductions in visceral adipose tissue, sub-Q tissue, gluteal tissue. As long as it's done right, you can actually really impact those different depots.
So even independent of exercise, I mean, protein can influence this?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we've seen several different studies now where you're looking at the protein impact alone on what's happening with fat metabolism and both sides of that. So both the liberation of fat from a fat cell and the oxidation of it, so that you would actually be losing or burning fat. And yeah, with our work and those of others, like protein's pretty darn powerful.
So what exactly, even from a mechanistic side, I mean, audience is pretty savvy. Like they can hang. So I mean, like with regards to even the mechanisms, like how is protein doing this? Is it just a thermic effect? Is it like what's it doing?
It's probably a combination. Sure. I mean, the thermic effect is clearly there with the protein feedings, but some of the issues around it, it's always so nuanced, right? There's so many other things involved when you start feeding or doing exercise trials, as other parts of your life's sort of just robustly increase in health behavior.
For sure.
And so we start to get complicated. But the protein side alone, I mean, there's data where really high loads, like 3.3 up to like 4.4 grams per kilo per day of protein in very fit individuals. And you're seeing either no change or reductions in body fat with those different trials.
Even, I mean, obviously, even with those amounts of that amount of protein, I would imagine other macronutrients are like how are those equated?
Yeah, I mean, in that work, some of that was from Jose Antonio's feeding studies in people who are very active or bodybuilders type individuals, and so they already had high protein diets. I mean, they were well over 2.2 grams per kg in the control group, and then they increased the other group to even higher. I mean, their doses were pretty darn high, and they tried to just simply increase that load with protein shakes so that the other macros would stay the same. But I'll tell you from experience, we've done trials where we weren't doing this in healthy individuals. They were breast cancer survivors, and we gave higher protein doses. And we actually made this mistake because we didn't look at the dietary intake till the study was over. And the satiating effect of protein made it so that the high protein group stopped eating their protein at meals. Yeah. And so by the end of the study, the groups are actually equated for protein intake, and we had waited too long to do the dietary analysis. So we keep learning along the way too, in terms of like just how profound that impact is for being satiating and also that thermic effect of food that you're getting.
I put a link down below for 30% off your entire first order with Thrive Market. Thrive Market focuses on the ingredient quality. That's why getting 30% off your first order with them is awesome. If you go to the grocery store, the reality is you have to spend a lot of time, and you need a practical PhD to really read the ingredients, to really understand and cross-reference. Thrive Market does that already. They do not have garbage ingredients coming into the food that they have on their digital shelves, so to speak. So the reason that I trust Thrive Market is because I know that even if I'm getting something that's like a sweet treat or something that I want to enjoy that's even a snack, at least I don't have to worry about having low quality ingredients. And you can sort by different diet type. I spent a lot of time in Europe recently, and I was just almost in love with the food quality there. And the thing that I like about Thrive is they do a good job of emulating the kind of food quality that's coming into the foods that they have. So that link down below gets you 30% off. It gets delivered right to your doorstep, and you get a free $60 gift with any purchase. So go ahead and check them out. It's in the top line of the description underneath this video.
From a fat loss perspective, how much separation is there between the different kinds of protein? Like, are there very clear, hey, whey protein is going to be less when it comes down to
no, there's nothing that distinct. I mean, I think it'd be cool if we saw those separations. I'm not aware of any data where you have a different type of protein impacting those tissues differently at all.
Which I think is awesome. I mean, that's a good thing.
Yeah, it gives options, right? A lot of what we do in our lab, for better or worse, comes out with no difference or, no drastic change that's exciting. But what it does, if we flip the way we look at that, it's a way to actually give people recommendations and not be afraid to do things. So even if there's no result, they can eat more protein. They can eat it later at night, for example, and not have a negative impact. And this is just another case of that.
So do you think that a lot of the protein effect when it comes to fat loss in general, is it just by the sheer fact that people that are eating more protein are probably subbing out other macronutrients because they're just eating more protein? Or like if all that was independent and you were just looking at increasing protein, like all other macronutrients stayed the same, because if you take someone off the street and you have them eat like 3.3, grams per kilo, they're probably not going to have much appetite to actually eat some potatoes or some rice, right? So does the macronutrient...
Right. So that's part of the deal is like you're going to, in the real world, you would end up hopefully having a distribution where the protein stays constant, but the percentage of the other macros will drop. A lot of times with the way we think about any of our foods is these AMDRs, where you have for proteins 10 to 35% for dietary intake is the recommendation. And Americans eat about 15%. And that pretty much hits the recommendation that's currently available. It's 0.8 grams per kg. But we want to be higher than that. And so when we go up to 2.2 grams per kilo, or basically a gram per pound, that's where we can start seeing that separation. And we see differences in their macronutrient intake. They'll start lowering carbs, they'll start lowering fats, and they'll be more satiated. So all of those things come together. It's not magic. It's just a big tool, a big hammer to use in this process of weight maintenance or body composition change.
Would you say, like in your experience, that you're granted a little bit more slack in the realm of calories if you have more protein in that case?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think anyone who starts to switch to this health conscious way of eating and trying to really fit protein in there and their higher fiber intakes and stuff, you get a little bit more leeway. That's why people who like are super lean, you're like, oh, I see you eating all the time. It's like, yeah, but look what I'm eating. Yeah. You can eat a lot of it. The caloric, load, the caloric density and stuff is different. So you can actually eat quite a lot of food, but it's not going to be these high calorie foods.
Do you see any difference in the total fat loss, subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat? Like what's the ratio like that you've seen? Or is it all sort of when fat is lost, like an equal percentage, generally measurable in such a sense, is the same with visceral?
I don't know that we can put a percentage on it at this moment. I'll tell you the way we ran that study. This was with Paul Arciero at Skidmore College, and he was the lead on that study. And the first one that I was involved with, we fed about 40% protein to our higher protein group, and the other group got about 15% protein. They also had different exercise regimens because we were comparing like the old school American Heart Association program against, at the time, which was the Body for Life program put out, by Bill Phillips, back in the day. And that program included resistance training and some high intensity running or aerobic exercise, which was like, probably only 20 minutes a day. So it was like a different sort of a program. But if you look at just at the protein spread, everybody did great on both programs. But with the higher protein intake, those folks lost significantly more visceral adipose tissue and sub-Q fat. And we were, measuring this in all areas with a full body DEXA, and then we honed in on visceral adipose tissue as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think with visceral fat, it seems to be highly individual too. I think there's a lot of other factors that come in with stress and sleep deprivation, things like that on visceral fat. So it's probably hard to really equate for all of that stuff.
Yeah, and it depends how you're measuring it too. I mean, we're looking at this with DEXA. There's people who do it with MRI, which we're not doing currently, but I think it's just going to continue on this path of showing that, in this case, protein is going to be one of the things that influences that. And I tell you, it's better when you exercise with it. I would say if you're just at the lowest hanging fruit, I would increase your protein intake, but starting to add in the different types of exercise, resistance training, different modes, that's where you're going to see the biggest impact.
I think one of the more kind of liberating things from even the early part of this discussion is that this can be achieved just with a protein shake too. It's not like, I think people sometimes, they're busy, you don't have time to cook up a bunch of ground beef or a steak or something like that. And I think there's like a sort of a misconception about protein shakes in general. Like, I mean, I have no problem adding a couple of whey protein shakes in just to get that number up. So I think, when I hear that, because it's just there's so much noise out there surrounding different types of protein. It sounds like at the end of the day, like protein's kind of protein.
Yeah. Well, for this, what we're talking about, absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a couple of things to consider. I think you and I would be very inclined to add a protein shake, but there's definitely people who don't like it. They don't like the taste, the texture. Yeah. you hear it, right?
Sure.
I know a lot of folks like that. And so you can do this with whole foods, absolutely. But it's work. Like you really have to be thinking ahead. What are you going to have? What are your options? It's so convenient to throw a shake, a packet of protein powder in your bag, and off you go. That's in our world. You better have some convenience or this will never get done. So yeah, we use shakes all the time, but you definitely don't have to do it that way.
Yeah, I was going to say, like in a lab setting, when you're really trying to increase protein intake, are you generally increasing it via shakes just because it's easier for real people?
Generally, yes, but there are certainly different studies where we've done long feeding studies where we're working with a team of dietitians and get everybody's dialed in on what they're eating each week in their food. But the protein in terms of just a powdered shake that we give once, twice, 3 times throughout the day, it's just so convenient to get someone up 75 grams in our higher protein trials.
I think, most of your work that you're most noted for is surrounding protein timing and protein feeding, particularly at night. And this is an area it's a lot of kind of contention around it. People get really hung up on timing protein at night. Should you have protein before bed? Does it aid in muscle protein synthesis? Is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak? And this is really, this is what you're known for. You've talked to Andy Galpin about this. This is you. So what have you found? Like, what does eating protein at night do or not do?
So let me back up a little bit, because this story is kind of neat and kind of how this stuff got started. We originally got into this around 2010, and I was a new researcher starting at Florida State, and we were looking around and I'm thinking, man, the people who are the most lean that I know eat late at night. But then we had this sort of contrasting view with different TV shows and things, weight loss shows where they're saying cut off, stop eating at this time, stop eating at 7 p.m. or whatever it was. And so that was the initial question, which is so great about my job, is like we can see these things and try to answer these in real life. And so we started our first trials looking at just that. What if we gave whey, casein, carbohydrate, or like a water placebo? And we would give people this. And it's important to define this. The way we have done it, and the other people in this space, is you're feeding this 2 hours after dinner. So it's not your dinner.
Okay.
It's 2 hours after dinner and within 30 minutes of going to sleep.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's a very specific time for this.
And no additional carbohydrates or anything, just straight protein?
The original trials were either 100% whey, 25 to 30 grams, 100% casein, straight carbohydrate, so we could calorie match, or a water placebo.
Cool. All right.
And so different groups have looked at this. Like when we were starting this work, the only other lab doing this was Luke Van Loon's lab overseas. And they do fantastic mechanistic work with muscle protein synthesis, which we can get into. Our lab was more on the applied side, what's happening with metabolism, recovery, performance. And then we've just now sort of getting a lot more into sleep and sleep dynamics with pre-sleep feeding. But when this originally started, we were looking at metabolism. And so we did this in young men, young women, older men, older women, those with obesity, those without obesity. So we've looked at it from all these different angles. And one of the things we found was that feeding before bed of anything, carbs, whey, or casein, increased morning resting metabolic rate. So when we were measuring this in the lab, they had a small uptick compared to having just water. So something was happening metabolically. We quickly realized that we were missing something in this design, because I would give you something to take home. You'd tell me you took it.
Yeah.
And then you come back in the morning, which adds a whole host of issues to this. So then we started setting up designs that my graduate students don't love, where you would actually sleep in the lab. And so we set up these cots and these sleeping centers where people would actually sleep over in the lab at the night. And we found similar things. Either no change or a small uptick in morning metabolism. We also measured things like satiety and appetite, and from a scale, like, how hungry do you feel? And in all of that work, the conclusion that kept coming up was either there's no change at all, or you have a little bit of an increase in metabolism measured by resting metabolic rate, and we have a small uptick in satiation, or satiety in the morning. But we're wondering the whole time, is that good or bad?
Yeah.
If you're not hungry in the morning and you're not eating, is that a good thing for weight maintenance? Is that a bad thing? What does that actually do? And so along those same times, we actually did a study in people that were overweight And we did an acute feeding. And no matter if it was whey, casein, or carbohydrate, we saw a negative. And the negative to that was that they had a small uptick in glucose. And the glucose put them into a range in the morning that we weren't really happy with. And so we said, okay, so in certain populations, maybe this isn't the right avenue. And so we took that same population, and instead of doing one night, we did 4 weeks of it and added a little bit of resistance training. So over those 4 weeks, they simply worked out 3 times a week with us. Short, full body exercise regimen. And when we added exercise to this, all of those negative changes went away. So the power of exercise is just huge, and it's going to be the thing driving the momentum of the changes, the physiological changes that we're looking for. And that little bit of protein was perhaps a help. But in all this context, 2 things happen. One of them is that we really were missing what was happening mechanistically. And so we added a technique in order to solve that problem. And one of the things that I learned through graduate school is a technique called microdialysis. And this is a technique where we thread a very small probe underneath your skin into your subcutaneous abdominal adipose tissue. So imagine like pinching your belly fat and a small catheter prick in there, and then you remove the needle and just leave a flexible tube underneath the skin. And then we can perfuse fluid in there. So think about saline going into the tissue, and then we can collect what's coming out of there. So we should collect saline, which you put in, plus whatever's coming out of the fat cells. And so we can measure glycerol, which is an indicator of lipolysis in that case. And so we said, let's put these in and have people sleep with them so we can measure all night what's happening to fat metabolism as individuals are asleep. And when we did these trials, and we started with younger men that were overweight or obese, we've also done this in young women and fit people and all types of populations. And in our hands, every single time, we see absolutely no difference in fat metabolism if you have 150, 160 calories of protein or if you had nothing. And so I remember my doc student coming to me and saying, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? We didn't see anything. I can't, this data are terrible, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, what that does is it shows that you have an option. You can eat something before bed and it's not going to increase, the putting on body fat or anything. It's not doing anything to the body fat stores at that low calorie level. And so for us, that was kind of eye-opening, and it helps with some of the instructions we give to people because in general, people aren't eating towards that higher end of protein. And so we can say, this is a great time to feed to get your total daily protein intake up, which is probably the magic. It's just getting the total daily protein intake to a level that we really want. Maybe not necessarily that it's right before bed, but you're usually home, you have access to food. For sure. It's an easy time to do it. It's not going to put on fat. It might uptick metabolism. So there are some benefits to it. And I think practically, probably one of the most interesting studies was Luc Van Loon's study, where they did this for 12 weeks with resistance training and pre-sleep protein feeding. They had a little carbohydrate in there as well. And in an applied aspect, the group that had the pre-sleep feeding over those 12 weeks, and the same mechanism, 30 minutes before bed, et cetera, those individuals had real outcomes, more strength, more muscle mass over that period of time. Now, the criticism was they actually had more protein in their total day by having the pre-sleep feeding. So it ended up being like 1.9 versus 1.3, and the 1.9 group won out, which you'd expect. And so the criticism was, well, if you equated protein, it probably wouldn't happen. And they said, yeah, well, that's the whole point. You have a chance to take protein that gets your total daily protein intake to a better level, and it's going to help with these applied outcomes. So in that sense, I think there's something to it in terms of like having an option. It's not going to do anything negatively to fat metabolism, and it may help get you to a level for total daily protein intake that would help with a little bit with strength and some of these size applications that people want.
What did you guys measure, like fat oxidation and like the subsequent workout in the morning?
Yeah, so we didn't do a workout, but we did resting metabolism, so we could see if it was how that was changed, and it followed suit with what you'd expect. When we didn't do microdialysis, when we simply fed people in the morning, they had this increase in total metabolic rate, and then we also looked at RQ, which would give us a measure of the fuel use. Kind of rudimentary, but you get the idea for it, and the having nothing kept RQ low, which means a higher fat oxidation, and having casein did the same thing. It looked like whey and carbohydrate were slightly uptick. Now, none of that was statistically significant, but if you look at the numbers, and I'm if I'm trying to be hyper specific about something, I would, in that case, casein sort of won out in terms of it looked like it stayed just like a placebo, absolutely nothing.
Wow.
And keeping fat metabolism higher.
That's crazy. So yeah, because it kind of flies in the face of saying, the longer that you are in a fasted state, the more fat you're going to burn in a workout in the morning.
Yeah, we didn't do the workout part of it, but
I mean, by looking at, how much is really going to change if you're looking at resting? I know you're
sure, and I think it adds what it does. I think practically is it gives people again a chance to choose something that could be beneficial and won't harm them.
Totally.
And then you have just extra, options to look at. Now, the criticism again that we get even now continues because there's still big questions in this space. Like sleep is like the biggest thing right now that we're looking at. A lot of people kept reviewing our papers or commenting on things we were doing, saying, what about sleep? What about sleep if I eat? And then you have companies that are pushing, don't eat before bed. We've got data that show it's problematic for sleep quality and sleep duration and sleep onset and these other things. So we did sort of a deep dive into that literature, and it was not as clear cut as you might think or as you would read about on the social media. And so we started heavily investing in that space. We have a couple of studies going right now, and I think probably the biggest thing is that if you have a very large meal, not 150 calories, like a meal, that could be detrimental. And there are some data to show that. Large mixed meals, carbs, fats, proteins, everything all together. We're talking about a protein dominant food or shake.
For sure. Yeah.
And it's a sort of a different beast when you're looking at 150, 60 calories versus 600 calories, in a load. And so those are some of the areas that we're trying to look at now is does the quality of the food matter? Because people always want us to do like the ice cream and pizza studies, know. And does the quantity matter? So if we did like a scaling of 150, 300, 450, and on up, at what point does it churn from neutral or no or even positive to a negative impact on sleep or any other health outcome? And so those trials are underway. We don't have answers on all that stuff quite yet.
I suppose a lot of it would depend on like where your standard protein intake is to begin with too, right? Like if I can speak anecdotally and say like if my protein needs aren't met, I don't sleep good, right? So like if you're talking about even just somewhat regular people that just regularly resistance train, but maybe they're not elite athletes, I think they would probably find that if they had their protein needs met, they might sleep better, right? Like I feel like I'm in, for lack of a better term, like more of a sympathetic state if I'm like under proteined, also if I'm under caloried. So perhaps there's the nuance there where it's like, it doesn't mean that everybody is going to benefit from just taking in protein before bed. I think what you're trying to say here is like, if you're trying to get more protein in, like you probably are doing more good than bad by having some protein before bed. The net positive is probably.
That's sure what it looks like. And there's even some things like a couple years ago, Falkenberg put out a paper and it looked at the different types of foods that people are consuming before bed. And it looked like if it was protein, you actually had a better sleep onset latency, meaning the time you get in bed to falling asleep was shortened, which is a good thing. But if it was higher in sugar, higher in carbohydrates, then that was reversed. And so there's a lot of nuance that still needs to be done and studies that need to be done to figure out types of foods, mixed foods, because unless it's a protein shake, a lot of people don't eat single macronutrients. Yeah, and so you're eating food. Of all the data, I've seen a couple of like whole food kind of studies. We did one with cottage cheese because it's higher in casein content and it was kind of a neat design. So we went to the store, we bought off the shelf cottage cheese. Then I sent that to a company to powder the exact same mixture. And so we looked at it as a semi-solid cottage cheese, a powder, or a placebo to see does the consistency matter,
digestive load,
and what's happening with all of that. And like we've been saying, absolutely no difference.
Seriously, because that was my next question:
cottage cheese or powdered cottage cheese or a placebo in terms of these general outcomes of metabolism. We measured sleep in that one as well, and so again, there's different options. It looks like cottage cheese was fine. The thing we're moving into now and some of our newer grants are looking at like whole food options, other specific foods that have potential to improve sleep, higher melatonin and B vitamin content and, some of these things and magnesium, for example. And so I feel like there's going to be a movement now in this space where are we going with it? And even specialty foods. For example, there's a whey derivative called alpha-lactalbumin. Have you heard of this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So alpha-lac, it didn't have much traction. It was now it's considered like a new player in the space, but it's been around a long time. So it's been in like formula for infants because it's a higher concentration in mother's milk.
Interesting.
And so then now they have, they've figured out a way. So they've powdered in infant formula forever. Now they've fractioned that out and they're selling it to adults. And so it has a high tryptophan ratio. And so because of that, the thought is, well, maybe it helps with sleep. And so there's been 2 studies, 2020, 2021 timeframe in rugby players that actually showed alpha lac versus other types of protein actually had a benefit on sleep outcomes. And so we're replicating that now to see how it works in our lab. And we're using elite female athletes at FSU to figure that out. And so we're looking at alpha lac, Wheys, some different versions of it in a placebo over 3 nights of feeding.
Interesting. So like, where do you think most of the talk and the hubbub surrounding stopping eating a few hours before bed comes from? Is it mainly just like in the insulin resistance community where basically, I mean, because I think it's wildly different between someone that has a healthy metabolism and not, perhaps.
There's sound reasoning. I mean, if you look at some of the like original studies, so like 1993, for example, there were some studies that started to come out, and like the one that comes to mind gave 544 calories at 3 different times. And you had that at either 9 a.m., 5 p.m., or 1 in the morning. And they gave the same food at each time and just measured all these metabolic outcomes that came from it. And like your response to that food was far worse at 1 in the morning than it was at 9 in the morning. So there are, like, we know it's not, you're slowing down. You're going to have a natural reduction in metabolic rate, for example. You're heading to sleep. You also handle glucose worse at that time than earlier in the day. And so if you think about that, be like, yeah, why would I eat before bed?
Yeah.
And again, I think there's 2 bigger things to consider. One's like, we're not talking about meals here. We're talking about 30 minutes before bed, a snack, a protein snack, really. But in a whole food sense, it does look like there's some worse outcomes. The other area are night shift workers. Those individuals, there's a lot of data here with if you're eating through the night and late at night, you have worse metabolic outcomes. But then that's confounded by what are your choices late at night if you're a night shift worker, not bringing foods with you. So that, sort of plays into that. And then people that have conditions like where they eat most of their calories very late in the evening, there's a whole slew of data in that space too that all have negative outcomes.
Yep.
So I think people see that, they get a little nervous about eating late. And there's other data also, like clearly if you eat a lot of your calories later in the day, your chance association with being obese is higher.
Yeah. And
BMI changes and these other things. But again, I think in a normal, healthy individual, this is a different story. We're also talking about a small calorie load. Yeah. And I think between those things, you really have an opportunity to feed that could be beneficial in the way we're speaking about it, as opposed to a giant fast food meal, right before bed.
And I think historically, people that probably load calories in the evening are probably not making the best decisions. So I'm sure that large data is kind of skewed, right? It's like you look at especially a metabolically unhealthy person or something, they're really not eating much throughout the day, and then they're emotionally fatigued by the end of the day, and the choices they're making at the end of the day are not exactly, like you said, we're talking 150, 160 calories of essentially a single macronutrient. We're not talking about a meal here. Whereas if you probably look observationally at most things, like people that eat a lot of calories at night are probably eating crap.
No doubt. Now, there's another area I want to talk about though. And this is your audience who are athletic or very physically active. From all the data I've been describing in this space, the best outcomes, and there's some data with like professional soccer players, for example, if you exercise in the evening and pair that with pre-sleep feeding, those outcomes are generally positive.
Okay.
Now, just to play devil's advocate, I actually have a study that flies in the face of that out of my own lab. But in general, that's what we're seeing. If you exercise in the morning and do pre-sleep feeding, it looks like it's a little bit less important for some of these outcomes. So that's something to consider. The other one's for athletes. Like if you're a high level athlete, many times you have games at night.
Yeah.
Or if you're a working individual and you've got kids and your only time to do this is late at night, you're setting yourself up for a situation where if you don't eat, you could be impaired tomorrow.
For sure.
You have to think about the next workout or the next practice or the next game in these examples. And so like, for example, if you work out hard tonight and you also want to work out tomorrow morning, you should probably eat after your workout. Yeah. So there are so many nuances to this. And so the blanket statement of don't eat before bed, then I'm I always comment on these things. I'm like, well, what time of day are you exercising? What's your total food intake?
Yeah, for sure.
Do you have low energy availability and you need to have more food at this period of time? Do you practice again tomorrow morning? What is the time frame for all this? So I feel like the nuance gets lost, which is common. But I think the general message needs to be much more clear, which is a small, at least at this point, protein dominant food that's 150 to 200 calories is either going to do nothing or would give you a benefit.
Yeah, a little bit of a digression, but I'm curious if you've seen any of this. As far as performance the next day, what do you find to be more important? The overall calorie load that you end up getting in the day prior or the protein load?
In a one-off scenario, probably the calorie load for sure. But let me tell you about one of these studies that sort of, I think, would highlight this a little bit. So professional soccer players, they had an evening game. And then after the game, they gave 40 grams of protein or a placebo. And when they did that, they then measured performance in two ways. One was a counter movement jump. One was a reactive strength index, which was like jumping off of a heightened box and then being told with a force plate on the ground, spend as little time on the ground as possible. Like how quickly can you jump off of that? And if you had that 40-gram bolus those 3 nights after the game, you came back to baseline much faster than the other group. And so in a real sense, in a real game, in real athletes, that study showed that there was a benefit. Now, not every study shows that, but that was one that was really interesting to look at in terms of outcomes we might measure from this. And so, maybe we don't see it in maximal strength. Maybe we don't see it in some of these more whole body movements, but in something like reaction, or these counter movement jumps or whatever, that might be where you pick up some of these performance benefits.
Yeah, and if you're seeing it in reaction, you're probably having subtle differences that you're not realizing in neuromuscular control and things like that, right?
Exactly.
So it's like those that makes a difference when you're trying to flirt with injury. You're like doing deadlifts and you're at risk of blowing out your back, and it's just like all about proper activation. But these subtle things that you may not really think about, but it makes a difference in terms of the recovery.
Let me give you a good example. So we had a really cool study where we were looking at athletes that were competing in Ultraman, Florida. So that is a 3-day triathlon. So like on Friday, they do a 10K swim and like a 95-mile bike ride. And then they go to sleep, wake up, start again, and they bike a very long way, like 180 miles or something. And then on Sunday, they go to sleep, wake up. On Sunday, they run a double marathon. So this is all over 3 days. And it's not continuous. So your time stops when you finish on Friday and starts again the next morning to add to your time.
Yeah.
And so in this case, if you're finishing late and you don't eat and pay attention to what you're going to eat because you're finishing at night and you have to start again at 6 a.m., you will not complete that race.
Yeah.
And so those athletes and people who have things like that, like it's not about pre-sleep feeding being good, bad, or other. You have to do it. You will not finish the race in that type of a scenario.
Yeah, that's wild. I mean, I think that sometimes the glucose crowd and the low glucose crowd, which is so loud sometimes that it overshadows some of this really important stuff, right? It's like, I think it's wildly different. I mean, have you looked at people with insulin resistance in sort of this fashion and how because let me back up for a second. In the pre-bed feeding, there was what did the glucose group look like? What did the carbohydrate group look like that was different from the protein group? Because you gave one group that was how many? 30 grams?
Yeah, the original studies were 30. They now the recommendation is 40, and 40-gram bolus seems to be primarily because you're trying to sustain a heightened muscle protein synthesis for a longer period of time, like 7-8 hours. Most of the daytime feeding studies are like measuring for maybe 3 or 4 hours. So it's a larger bolus at that period of time. I'm sorry, what was the question?
It was what did you really see? Like how much of a difference was there between the glucose group and the protein group?
Yeah, so it depends on the metric we were looking at and what other people have done in their designs. In our original studies, the RQ value, so fat oxidation, and this wasn't statistically significant, but if you had the carbohydrates or the whey, you were slightly higher in RQ, meaning less fat oxidation. So that was the difference between casein. There's been several studies now looking at specifically muscle protein synthesis, and doesn't seem to be a difference between whey and casein, by the way, just so your audience knows they can choose whichever one they like for that outcome. And then the other sides of that, some of them don't give a carbohydrate placebo. They just give a water placebo. So it's hard to compare what that's actually doing. In the sleep outcomes so far, carbohydrates in a lower dose, we're talking 30, 40 bolus here, a gram bolus, no difference in sleep outcomes. And we started this whole deal with not talking about sleep. And then so the reviewers were like, hey, how'd they sleep? And I'm like, I don't know. We got to add that to the next study. So then we started doing surveys, and then that got to be not robust enough. And then we started doing trackers. And so that's really why these new studies we're doing are the first time we've designed them with the primary outcome of sleep, and instead of a secondary or tertiary outcome for those.
I'd imagine that wildly depends on the person's metabolic status. I mean, really, it's like, I would imagine subjective sleep was probably decent with the glucose group, just because sleep onset might be good, just because that's kind of the old school thing was, hey, a little hyperglycemia and a little drop right before bed might help you fall asleep faster. So maybe you're getting more that first 3-4 hours of deep sleep, and then your REM is disrupted, but you're not going to measure that with a Whoop, really. It's kind of hard to get that solid data.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think you have to have like polysomnography and some of these other techniques that are available, CPG and things that are coming out now. But I don't know. I think overall, the metabolic outcomes, I would still favor to have the protein dominant food. The recovery items I would do. The soccer data looked like it was protein being different from carbohydrate with those two specific outcomes for muscle recovery, RSI and counter movement jump. So there is something happening. I don't know if it's enough to matter to normal people, but for high-end athletes, it might. And you would need the carbohydrates for other things. So it's just really, what are you looking at it for? For sure.
And I think a lot of it's splitting hairs. But with the cottage cheese, was it full fat cottage cheese, or were you guys using a low fat to try to bring the fat?
It was a low fat cottage cheese. Yeah. And that was a neat study. The other people have done pre-sleep work with milk, just like your mother told you. In those studies, no difference in any marker at all overnight or in the morning. And again, does that mean it's bad? No, I mean, it's not doing anything. And if you're hungry, have a glass of milk. And it gets your protein totals up, your total calories up. If you're an athlete, that could be necessary. One area that we have looked at that wasn't in people with glucose control issues, but we started to use different products before bed. So our first one was a chocolate milk. And we looked in the morning at endurance performance. The second study we did in that space was looking at a product called UCAN Superstarch, which is traditionally pitched to people with glucose issues, right?
It's like a cyclic dextrin kind of thing?
Kind of. They hydrothermally modify the carbohydrates, and it keeps insulin extremely low. It's like a small drip of glucose into the system. And it was originally developed in a medical space, which was for people with glycogen storage disease. And I love how performance nutrition goes clinical to sports, and sports goes sports back to clinical. It's like really kind of an exciting place to be in, and it's ever evolving. But we did several studies with those products. So the first one we did was that chocolate milk one. And the thought was this: if you don't need to wake up early to run your race, instead you can have this before bed to sort of top off your stores or whatever. Does that help with GI? Does that help with a little more sleep? You don't have to wake up earlier to eat, these types of things. And it didn't do much. It increased carbohydrate oxidation in the morning. So theoretically, maybe you could run at the higher end of things, but it didn't turn out to be a performance difference. And then we started in this UCAN Superstarch space. And we did several studies during the day with it in performance, which we can get into if you want, but we used it at night because we thought that slow drip of glucose may be enough to keep glycogen and blood glucose a little bit higher in the morning, so they could run a 10K or a 5K or whatever it is faster in the morning. And again, we did not see that. We didn't see any change in performance outcomes in doing it in that particular way. And it was either probably a dosing structure. I'd love to try it with a higher dose, or maybe try it in a sport where you don't have access to being able to eat, maybe like in long swimming or something where getting foods in are a little bit more difficult. Because, in running, you can go by an aid station. So the practicality becomes an issue. But we're trying to crack this nut from different ways and see, is there a product or food or a combination of things or a training status where this would be potentially optimal. But, I feel like I'm saying it over and over, but the way that we get there is you got an option. You don't have to be hungry if you want to eat, but just make a wise choice at that time. It's either going to not harm you, it'll increase your total daily protein intake, which will be a benefit. It could increase your total calorie intake. So if you're someone who suffers from LEI or REDS or something, then you have an opportunity to sort of boost your total calorie intake. It might help with performance. And nothing so far has shown a detriment eating and feeding the way we're talking about.
I'd be curious what it does to like even CK levels the next day, right? Like what is it doing for overall recovery from a subsequent workout?
Well, we did that one. So one of the cool ones we did was we were finally looking at a vegetarian-based protein. And so this was led by Pat Saraceno, a former doctoral student of mine, and it was his dissertation. And he was looking at a rice and pea combination protein in order to match the amino acid profiles. Okay. And it was powdered, so it was a shake. And then we looked at that against whey hydrolysate and whey isolate and a placebo. Then we took middle-aged men who were active individuals and put them through a kind of a grueling eccentric only leg extension and leg flexion series. So 150 reps each leg of eccentric only. So to damage on purpose. And then we tracked all the inflammatory markers and some performance metrics over the next 72 hours. So you'd come back in each morning for some of these things. So one, in this population and with that protocol, that was very damaging. And so nobody came back to normal in a typical time frame from any of the blood biomarkers. And there was no difference between any of the proteins that we used.
Interesting.
So we either damaged them so bad that nothing came back and it was a little bit too hard. So maybe that was the problem. Or dosing was different, or just, it doesn't matter. Choose the protein you want.
Yeah. Or I mean, if you start looking at it over the longer term, you know, then when is it going to start? I would, have you seen anything on, like, obviously we're talking a lot of it, like kind of acute protein load, but what about longer term? Is there some data on that? Like maybe over the course of a couple of weeks or a month?
Yeah. There's only like 2 or 3 studies that I'm aware of on that. So the original ones were way back in 96, and that was a longer term feeding of a higher carbohydrate, a higher protein, or a higher fat diet for over time. And they just measured sleeping metabolic rate. Okay. And if you had the higher protein diet over a longer period of time, you just kind of, your metabolism sort of hummed a little bit higher while you were asleep.
Got it.
All right. So that, you got to interpret it how you want for, is that good, bad, or indifferent? I guess if it's weight maintenance or something, perhaps that's a good thing. Yeah. So that was one of those. The other one was that one I described, which was 12 weeks of pre-sleep feeding from Luc Van Loon's lab that showed some of the benefits that were good, but no one's really done it longer than that continuously. But, you know, in the bodybuilding world and the physique competitor world, a lot of people will wake up purposefully to have food. Yeah. Or a protein shake. And so that's always a study that I've wanted to run, was what's the difference between just taking it before bed and sleeping, or waking up at 3 a.m. and pounding a protein shake and going back to bed.
For sure.
Because that disruption in sleep may be something, I don't know, that's never been done, but I think that would be a real practical thing for that athlete. Yeah.
I mean, if someone's just fluxing at a different capacity because they have a lot of muscle mass, like I find if I'm under caloried or under protein, my sleep is crap, right? And it's like, so someone like that with a bodybuilder that has a large amount of muscle mass, I mean, their BMR is so high anyway, right? They might be a little bit of an anomaly where they can get up in the middle of the night and do that. It might actually help their sleep. You know Stan Efferding? Mm-hmm. He talks about how he keeps a sandwich and a protein shake on his nightstand. He's hilarious. I mean, he's just gigantic anyway. So he's just that was his solution when I was going through a bout of insomnia. He's like, Thomas, got to have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a protein shake, 60 grams. Just have it on your nightstand.
Did it work?
He's like, when I get up to pee, hell no. No. So it's that was one more thing. It was taking me like 8 minutes to chow that down. You know, it wasn't like I could just so by then I'm awake.
Oh, goodness. Yeah. I mean, I was speaking with Darren Willoughby, who's a researcher, but he's also an enormous individual. And he was saying that he would do that. He just keep a shake right there in the bathroom. And then if he got up to use the restroom, and just down it goes. Or he walks in and pulls the leftovers out and eats them in the middle of the night.
Yeah, dude, it works for some people, especially like I said, when you have that much muscle. Well, Dr. Mike, where can everyone find you, man?
I'm trying to not be so hidden, but there are some places. So just at Mike Ormsbee is the place to go for Instagram, or X or whatever to find out what we're doing. We also have a lab account at FSU ISSM. That is a place to see what the lab is up to. But yeah, follow those things. We've got new content coming out. We've got study designs. We've got kind of behind the scenes look at a real active lab at the Institute of Sports Sciences and Medicine. Cool little place to visit.
Nice, man. Thanks, brother.
Thanks.